Hello, welcome to Loremasters Lair. I'm your Loremaster, and today we are doing something a little different. For the last few months, I have posted videos about Pathfinder and Galarian with some Starfinder bits sprinkled in. However, at times this has seemed, routine. Walk through countries, God video once a month, monthly market every 1 or 2 months. Try to find a way to go into the bigger happenings in the community. However, I am the Loremaster. This is Loremasters Lair. I want to do more than just my own spin on topics other people have probably already done. And part of the reason why I have side tangents in my videos. But even most times they are just connecting back to bits of lore on other topics that alone don't have enough for their own video. So I am going to do more. For the next 3 weeks, instead of talking about Pathfinder, I'll be talking about topics of things found in Pathfinder and doing an entire section showing where they come from, as well as showing the full breadth of this topic, potentially giving some people ideas for homebrews. This will be called, I'll leave it to future me who has to post the videos to figure that out. Sorry me. Either way, for our first topic, we'll be going to talk about something I have regretted for months now. In the Oceania video, I spoke of mummies as a side tangent. However, I could not cover every topic of mummies related to Pathfinder. And that does not even go into the full history of mummification to begin with. Part of the reason I decided to do this to begin with, actually, was to rectify this mistake. So, let's wrap this up. That's more of an ending line. Whatever, go. First, the basics. A mummy, by definition, is a dead body whose flesh and/or organs have been preserved as not to decompose further. This can be done in various ways, being kept in dry places, in cold places, in places with lack of air, or by being exposed to chemicals. It can also be done both either by accident or intentionally. The most famous, of course, are the Eqyptian mummies, but they can be found across every continent, and both humans and animals. The oldest known intentional mummy was found in Nevada's Spirit Cave at 9,400 years old, with the oldest natural human mummification being a severed head found at an Incan excavation site dating at 6,000 years old. That already gives some interesting ideas for tabletop, does it not? However, let's start with the classics. Eqyptian mummies. These are the ones we have the most examples of, and which have had the most extensive studies done on them. As many know, Eqyptian mummies were made as part of the Egyptian religious practice, as they believed that the state of the physical body would affect their body in the afterlife, similar to some modern beliefs such as that of Christians. There are actually 3 methods of Eqyptian mummification described from fragments of text from Egyptian sources and about them by the contemporaries. First and most extensive and expensive began with dehydrating the body. Then, because Egyptians mistakenly thought the brain only created mucus, they used a long rod to liquefy and drain the brain out the nasal cavity. The organs were then removed, with several organs placed in canopic jars. These were, say it with me, stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver. Never forget these are important. Well, not really, but if you care about mummification, these are important. Stash Egyptian mythology. Anyway, however, the heart, the place mistakenly thought back then, and by some still today, to be the center of human consciousness and the soul, was wrapped individually and returned to the body. After the cavity was washed with wine, which alcohol is a good disinfectant, and then it was filled with certain spices, including myrrh, cassia, and frankincense, to preserve the body. The body was then placed in natural salt known as natron to further dehydrate for 70 days. Exactly 70. The body needed to be dehydrated, but it still needed to be soft enough to actually move the limbs. Finally, the body was washed and wrapped in the famed linen bandages, which were treated to be made waterproof. A more inexpensive method for the middle class, instead of opening the torso, the mummifiers had the rectum plugged and had cedar oil injected, which served to melt both the organs and disinfect the area. The body then spent the same 70 days in natron before the plug was moved and the insides drained. The failure for them is unknown. Finally, the cheapest method was similar, but used an unnamed, much cheaper liquid. All in all, the three different methods were only distinguished by the method of organ removal. And burial, of course. Those that could not afford the most costly methods probably were not buried in large temples as we think of them. Now, before you leave Africa, I should also note that the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa also had widespread mummification before the conquest of Spanish, but most were destroyed since then from looting. Outside of Egypt, it is South America which has the largest number of mummies. One of the big examples is the Chinchorro mummies, some of the oldest in the world. Beginning somewhere in 5000 BC, all members of the Chinchorro people were mummified. This was done through removal of the internal organs and skin, and leaving the bodies to be dehydrated in the Atacama Desert. There were actually three overall techniques used here too. The black mummy technique had the body taken apart and dried in separate pieces before having the body pieced back together and covered in white ash paste to make it waterproof. And finally, their skins were painted with black manganese. The red mummy technique used an incision like Eqyptian mummification, though the head was removed to get to the brain instead of nose. When everything was stitched normally, the end result was then painted with red ochre. Finally, the mud coat method had the bodies, without the organs being removed, formed in a coat of clay, often artistically so. The clay would protect the inside from actually having to suffer from the outside, so no worries about any form of decomposition. Of the continent's most famous mummies are examples of unintentional mummification. Inca Mummies, also known as the ice mummies, are mummies from Argentina, Chile, and Peru from the time of the Incan Empire. These are various mummies found in the high, cold places of the regional mountains. Some suspect as ritual sacrifices due to young age and the stomach contents. The thing about these mummies is that they are not dehydrated. They're frozen state, leaving a body which looks just like a sleeping child, despite being over 500 years old. Seriously, look these up. Of course, the Incans also made intentional mummies, the practice only proving to have happened to their leaders and royal families, with most of them disappearing to, say it with me, the Spanish conquistadors. Meh. Next is Asia. Here, most mummies are assumed accidental. Starting with China, the large landmass leaves plenty of room for mummies to be found. This has led to some stranger incidents, including the case of Zin Zui, also known as Lady Di, who was mysteriously buried in conditions where mummification should not have occurred. In addition, she was buried with two other people, both who did compose under the same conditions, leaving an open question on why she was preserved enough to have an full autopsy performed on her. Another famed mummy, that dubbed as Princess Uko, is one of many Siberian ice mummies. She was discovered finely dressed, with a large retinue of hearses and ritualistic tattoos, including a nice-looking deer on her hand. Actually, many Siberian ice mummies had fine examples of tattooing, but we're not here to talk about tattoos. A more famed form of mummy from our friends in the East is the Shoko Shimbatsu, or living Buddhas. See, I can pronounce Japanese better than I can pronounce English. There are legends of widespread self-mummification of monks who self-mummified themselves through slowly lowering the intake of water and food over the days as they chanted mantras and meditated. This would eliminate all fat in the body, while slowly dehydrating it. Eventually, they would pass away in meditation, with nothing further needed to preserve their bodies. The practice was said to have been widespread in Japan, allegedly. Despite endless legends of these mummies being buried under mountains or temples, only 24 have ever actually been recovered. This has also inspired similar mummies to appear in media like Inuyasha or Shin Megumi Tensei, but to my knowledge we do not have it as of yet in Pathfinder, so... But next is Europe. Europe is home to a large number of bodies that are already represented in the Pathfinder universe. Bog bodies. These bodies are found in the marshes and swamps of northern Europe. These are interesting. The conditions of the swamp tan the skin so it remains, but the skeletal system is dissolved. Boneless mummies with organs still intact. And sometimes faces. No one knows if these bodies were intentional or not. What was intended to be preserved is that of the Capuchin monks, religious monks around the mountain border of the Czech Republic and Italy. Their crypts contain a unique air and soil composition, which allows the bodies to naturally be preserved over time. So, they are places that cause natural mummification that were intentionally used. That sounds like a fun thing to add to a game, doesn't it? Now we go to North America, where we, unfortunately, continue backwards aliens built the pyramid nonsense by saying Aztecs had mummies too. While I do not have any information on the internal preparations, externally I can say that they were also bundled in woven wraps, with the addition of Aztec-style masks. It should also be noted, these collections of mummies also contain among them an example of one of the youngest mummies in existence, a mummified fetus. Definitely don't want to see that in Pathfinder game, do you? And as mentioned earlier, a little further north in Arizona, a 9,000-year-old body was found lying on a blanket in Spirit Cave, as previously mentioned, and is the oldest known mummy in this. I'm just repeating what I've already said. Finally, we have the various islands of Oceania. Australia has some mummies. These are related to the more refined techniques of the Torres Strait, the small islands between Australia and New Guinea for those of us without a PhD in geography. These mummies had all this removed, seated in a chair where either the sun or a small fire would smoke them, till they were extra crispy. I mean dehydrated. That's a bad joke. They would then be dressed in their clothes or jewelry before burial. On the other side of the outback, New Zealand is also home to many mummies, known as mokomokai. These were heads, collected during the native Maori in their tribal warfare as trophies. These heads became a collection item for the various Europeans who interacted with the natives in the 19th century, especially because various tattooing of the Maori was still shown clearly on the faces. And while this is obviously colonialism, that does not mean some of you homebrewers might not feel the same way in your character designs as the collectors did about the heads. Now, before we leave the real world, let's not forget one category which is specifically not mummification: the religious idea of incorruptibility. It is when the body of a person does not decompose because of their holiness. Of course, when placed in reference of mummies, those of the Catholic faith will quickly point out that their version is different, that it is brought about as a sign of God's favor instead of being brought about by any natural means. It is said this is shown by smell, called the odor of sanctity, a floral or other pleasant aroma, which goes against the normal rot of decomposition. It is said to either appear as an actual smell or the feeling of a smell. Yeah, needless to say, incorruptibility is no longer used as a method to determine sainthood in the Catholic Church. And you can thank mummies for that in some way. In modern days, there are still a few examples of various mummifications. Jeremy Bertram, founder of the utilitarian movement, saw fear of mummified bodies as coming from ignorance. He purposely had himself mummified to be placed on display. Vladimir Lenin, because of the cosmism movement of Russia, was mummified with the idea to bring him back one day, but with a failure to cryogenically freeze his brain in time. In 1975, an organization named Sumum combined modern techniques with ancient methods to create modern mummies en masse. Sumum is currently considered the only commercial mummification business in the world. Finally, in a similar vein to mummies, plastination is a modern process to replace water and fats with plastics, which retains a body part for anatomical study without the rot or smell. There are currently more than 40 organizations worldwide that specialize in this process. Which brings us away from the real world and into the world of fiction, right where we all wish we were. Anyway, mummies, like many monsters, were first established in Gothic horror, in fact in 1827, with quotes on horror. Yes, that's right. Like many early monster novels, Jane C. Loudon's novel was a romance, and had the mummy more of a resurrection than an undead as they are thought of now. Because it always is with humans. After having hot zombie resurrection of the dead, including a parody of the trope by Edgar Allan Poe, we eventually got two other famed writers to bring mummies into the realm of horror as we know them. First, Arthur Conan Doyle, in a break from Sherlock, with his Lot number 249, and Bram Stoker, 6 years after Dracula, with The Jewel of Seven Stars. It was in the 20s, right after the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb, that our own Seeing Evil Everywhere friend, H.P. Lovecraft, first mass-produced Fear of Everything Egyptian, even though there are only a few stories with actual mummies in them in his collections. And then in the 30s, when Universal Studios brought about The Mummy with horror legend Boris Karloff, finally, mummies became even with other horror legends like werewolves and vampires. And it's not hard tracing them from there to tabletop. Now let's end this off with a, disgusting topic, which is a part of a series of trends which have made archaeologists angry at the Victorian era. They were known for, in their hubris of how intelligent and advanced they thought they were, fudging historical findings and scientific findings. Can probably do a video about that, talking about thousands of examples. Though in defense of the Victorian era, this one actually dates back to the 12th century, but lasted until the Victorian era. What they messed up today is that, while mistranslating Arabic texts, Europeans became convinced during the Middle Ages that researchers had found consuming mummy bodies were a miracle cure-all and, of course, aphrodisiac. That's right. We are dealing with holistic healing at its worst. Either way, mummy ashes, also known as mummia, became a supplement in the Renaissance diet. Your cannibalism could be done in two forms: just straight ashes, or have a corpse steeped in honey, which became known as a Mellified Man. Also, the ashes were also broken down into a basic brown paint known as mummy brown. And yes, I should mention, mummia is canon to Galorian. So these other two examples could be interesting additions into your game. I can already think of the Mellified Man becoming an ooze. Anyway, and that brings us to the end. Again, plenty there for people to dig into if they wish to create something for, any tabletop really, but this channel is Pathfinder, so either way, I hope everyone learned something. I was able to find their fiction becoming a little more real. We will be going through several more topics in the coming weeks, which I hope will give you a better idea of the games we like to play. Next week is the basics, where most other people would have started. Oops.